we go, mate. G'day, mate. 40 here. Just trying to squeeze in a live stream before the boss catches me. But I just signed up to the Patreon level of Decoding the Gurus and listening to a great interview with Helen Lewis of the BBC, and I think she may have been with the New Statesman. And they're all agreeing that you should not interview Nazis, because what the heck are you going to learn from them? And so I start thinking, as I've interviewed a lot of people who would be considered Nazis, right, why should you never interview Nazis? So I'm on the clock right now, so you'll have to excuse me. I'm hard at work watering. But why objectively should you not interview Nazis? And so one answer is that they are just essentially irredeemably evil. But if that's your argument, then you have to objectively believe in God. Right? Belief in good and evil requires a transcendent source of morality above your opinion, above my opinion. Essentially, it requires belief in God. Right? You believe in objective good and evil, then you have to believe in God. So I don't think people on the secular liberal left usually anchor their beliefs in God. But that's what you have to do if you're going to just say, oh, well, Nazis are irredeemably evil. So I don't think that's the basis, or they haven't been thinking clearly. So the other argument I guess they would make is that you don't learn anything. So this is essentially subscribing to an essentialist view of people, right? That if the term Nazi applies at all, then there's nothing to learn from it. But obviously that's bogus. Like, would you never learn anything from a Scientologist or Seventh-day Adventist or whatever the cult is, or the ideology or the race or religion is that you despise, or the ethnicity? I mean, that side of the argument just doesn't hold up. You never learn anything. So they mock, why would you hang out with a Nick Fuentes or a Baked Alaska or Richard Spencer? But all you're going to learn is that, they might like their mothers and they might like ice cream. And so this is, am I misreading this? This is subscribing to an essentialist view of Nazis, that if you can just put that tag on someone, then they lose all humanity, they lose all debt. But no, they don't argue that. They say being a Nazi is so heinous, it's so evil, that anything that you can learn from them is dwarfed by how bad their politics is. But they won't, they can't philosophically use the word evil, because that requires belief in a transcendent source of morality, God. So they'll just say, these people are so bad. And then you say, on what basis would you say bad? And then they say pragmatically, like all the people who've been radicalized and then gone out and done heinous things. So I'm thinking, if you want to talk, modern day, right, the number of people who've been radicalized, right, by the far right and gone out and done heinous things, right? They've perhaps killed, 100, 200, 300 people, which is awful, which is horrible. And I'm all for considerations. Luke used to rock with NPR while performing labor with the landscaping company LA back in the 1980s. Now he's rocking with podcasts, Decoding the Gurus, that's right. So I got a lot of time to fill while I'm watering away. So it's not exactly like a high cognitively demanding task that I'm performing right now. So I've got lots of time to cogitate, prepare my next big show, and listen to podcasts. So I'm mainly listening to The Power Broker, Robert Caro's biography of Robert Moses, the New York City Parks Commissioner and so-called most powerful man in New York City for about 30 years between the 1930s and 1960s. But also listening to The Daily Reprieve, a podcast of sex addiction talks. So once I feel like my head is on straight, then I can move on from The Daily Reprieve I check out Radix Journal to see what Richard Spencer has to say. I check out Ann Coulter. So I subscribe to Ann Coulter's Substack and Richard Spencer's Substack. So I check those out. I check Richard's Twitter feed in case he's done a space. And then I go to Decoding the Gurus, but now I've unlocked the membership for Decoding the Gurus. So I am behind the paywall. Lots of exciting stuff. Okay, so why should you not interview Nazis? Other answers, they have nothing interesting to say. And again, I find that terribly reductive. I just don't find that stands up. There are so many levels and nuances. It's just like reducing someone to being black or being Christian or being Muslim or being Jewish and saying, oh, everything you need to know about them is this, satisfied by this one categorization. Okay, then the argument is, yeah, they may have interesting things to say, but that is completely outweighed by the pragmatic badness of what they have to say and how it can easily transmit. Luke is an expert on interviewing Nazis. I defer to his judgment on this topic. Okay, and so if pragmatic, Luke is a Dr. Fauci of interviewing Nazis. It's Ricardo. Excellent, Ricardo. See, my side isn't the best right now with my sonnies. And, I have to take into consideration the effect that my words might have on other people if I was overheard right now. At work, I need to be a good representative of my family, of my workspace. Lots of considerations, flowing through my head as I do this socially acceptable, pro-social, psychologically and socially healthy live stream while getting in some watering, so my brother is getting his money's worth. I don't want to be bludging on the job. I don't want to be slacking off here. I want to be doing some high quality watering. If I don't do this high quality watering, right, you get shown up really quick because the plants start wilting, and then it makes me look bad. It looks like I lack conscientiousness, which I do lack. I do tend to lack conscientiousness. My mind does tend to wander. There are some ways that I'm not an ideal employee, such as my propensity to live stream on the job. So I want to fight against that negative stereotype. There's this negative stereotype out there that I'm shiftless, lazy, irresponsible, criminally inclined, prone to contracting and spreading STDs, fathering children that I then don't take care of. And I'm trying to fight against this negative stereotype. And so I want this live stream to fight against all these negative stereotypes there are of me out there. Okay, so if you want to argue that the pragmatic, anyone who fears the words of Nazis being allowed to consider has to admit that they think their own views are brittle. Right. Fundamentally, it comes down to, if you think ipso facto interviewing Nazis is bad, you're saying that your own views can't compete in the marketplace of ideas. I mean, you are frightened that Nazis have something to say that's socially appealing. What's the building behind you? I'm not sure I should say. It's a top secret CIA spying base that's used to monitor China and Russia's activities in the southern hemisphere, and I'm not allowed to videotape it directly, and so I got to keep that on the down low. But let me just put it this way: if China goes to war with Taiwan, the first thing they're going to hit is this bloody building behind me, because it's the whole secret to Western civilization, staving off the threat from autocratic, totalitarian, authoritarian powers. So when China goes to war with Taiwan, the first thing they're going to hit is this building behind me. And then they're going to hit Darwin, they're going to hit Okinawa, probably, God forbid, hit like naval bases in San Diego. They'll hit aircraft carriers in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, I hope I'm doing a good job here. Okay, so if you want to argue that just, interviewing people on the far right, they're just, pragmatically really bad, they're going to trigger people into doing, horrible antisocial things, then add up the death toll from people getting triggered online, radicalized online, doing horrible things. And you might get 100, 200, 300 people who've been murdered by these heinous acts of right-wing terrorism, and then compare that to the death toll of Black Lives Matter, which is well over 10,000 murdered, countless rapes, and then thousands of extra pedestrian deaths and traffic deaths. So on the pragmatic argument, you'd have to say you can't talk to anyone in Black Lives Matter. And then the rejoinder would be, well, 91% of Black Lives Matter protests are mostly peaceful. Well, guess what? 91% or above of far-right protests are mostly peaceful. So what's the... I don't want a straw man here. I want a steel man, right? 40 is the type of bloke who steel mans his adversary's strongest arguments. So I guess one excuse is that they're boring, right? That you shouldn't interview people on the far right because they're boring, they're Johnny One-Notes, they're one-dimensional, right? But that's not true, right? They're obviously fascinating. You wouldn't fear them being interviewed if they were so boring, because if they were so boring, nobody would pay any attention to them, right? You're afraid of the viral nature of what they have to say because you think that if 100 people listen to it, that 5-10% will be persuaded. So yeah, essentially saying you can't compete in the free market of ideas. Now, I am very open to pragmatic arguments. So if you want to present to me a significant case that interviewing people on the far right radicalizes a sufficient number of people that they go out and commit criminal acts, then yeah, I'm happy to look at that data and happy to reconsider. All right, I don't want to see people quitting their $120,000 a year jobs. Like, is it Patrick Little? You could try to see if it goes beyond the substrata of their belief. Like, what lies below their unconsciousness is the greatest fear of the left, and that is ignorance and bigotry. And so they think interviewing people on the far right will contribute to a furthering of ignorance and bigotry. So I think is that not the deepest part of this argument? That responsible people such as myself and other podcasters and live streamers and journalists, all right, we have to educate people, dispel ignorance and bigotry and old-fashioned ways of doing things that have now been superseded by our more advanced social science academic learning, right? So am I wrong? The greatest fear on the secular liberal left is the fear of bigotry and ignorance. And so I think the reason they don't want you to interview these people is that it will contribute to increased ignorance and bigotry in the world. And so they see the responsible man's primary mission is to reduce ignorance and bigotry in the world. I looked it up. I think it's a shopping mall. Yeah. Well, that's just what it says on Google Maps, because Google has been infiltrated by the deep state. I mean, weren't you paying attention to what Julian Assange and Edward Snowden were revealing? That the deep state, the CIA, has infiltrated big tech, and so they label all sorts of military bases. What makes them think their enlightened ways are superior? Wow, that's a deep question. But anyway, the deep state has infiltrated big tech, and so what big tech frequently labels as a shopping center, in reality, it's a CIA spying station. Okay, what makes them think their ways are superior? Boy, I should have a better answer for that. But, okay, here's one reason why they think their ways are superior. Your hero system and my hero system are crude and obvious. 40 is concerned about ex-girlfriends stalking him, God forbid. I remember when I broke up with one girlfriend, she called Dennis Prager's office and told him, how I had used and abused her. And so the first time I met Dennis Prager in Tampa Bay in January 1994, like I said, oh yeah, one of your ex-girlfriends called the office. Like, that was one of the first things that Dennis Prager said to me. Like, that was not my dream for the first time I met Dennis Prager. Was it he'd start talking to me about something that an ex-girlfriend had called his office. Then she wrote detailed letters to my parents, like talking about like everywhere in the house where we'd had sex, like in my dad's bathtub. I mean, a lot of different places. She set out to do maximum damage to my life. Like anyone she knew that I cared about, right? What the hell's wrong with my picture? She just set out to destroy me with regard to every important relationship in my life. So, and this happened to another friend of mine. He left the country because his ex-girlfriend just started sending faxes to his workplace. She just did absolutely everything to destroy him. I've never known a man to react this way. Like, obviously men can be stalkers and men are more likely to be violent than women. But I haven't heard about men trying to get their ex-girlfriends fired or sending faxes to their workplace. Oh, I fogged up my lens. That's what happened. Man, it's not easy to produce these high-quality live streams with the high-quality audio, the high-quality picture content, all while using the cheapest phone possible and getting that that bargain basement Aussie data plan as opposed to my T-Mobile plan. But I soldier on. But what are the pragmatic reasons why they think you should never interview? So one is that they're boring, which is clearly not true. One is that they're evil, and that has to presuppose belief in God. Another is that it's pragmatically bad for people. And that's not a 100% foolish statement, right? Because there are people like Patrick Little, right, who quit their job, supposedly their six-figure job. Bloody hell, these get a little wind here, and the plants blow over, and then it really gets in the way of my live streaming. Oh, bloody hell. Okay. A little wind, the plants blow over, and it just totally interferes with my train of thought. Okay, so yeah, some people are university professors, and they start reading a little bit of the Kant, and they can't handle it, right? And suddenly they're tweeting genocidal things, and they just totally go off the barrack, off the path. And so yeah, that's sad. And I think of all that Patrick Little could have contributed as an executive, and he ends up driving for Uber after he reads Kevin McDonald's Cultural Critique. And Greg Johnson at Countercurrents, he said that reading Kevin McDonald Cultural Critique, that's what convinced him to become a white nationalist. And Richard Spencer talks about how Kevin McDonald's the most important intellectual on the alt-right. So if the most important intellectual on the alt-right is being debunked by Jewish DPhil, Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford, was it not? Nathan Coffness. That doesn't say a lot of good things about the alt-right's intellectual bona fides. So yeah, I think exposing people to dangerous ideas is dangerous. I'm willing to grant that. I see the danger. I think the greater danger is saying, we can't expose you to these ideas because you can't handle it, and you'll go crazy if you get these ideas. So then you're not saying that the current political menu can't compete with what these crazy dissidents have to offer. So you're also saying that people are incredibly disconnected, right? So that they're vulnerable. People are looking for meaning and purpose in life. They're incredibly vulnerable to something that's going to give them meaning and purpose. And this dangerous dissident right-wing ideology is going to speak to incels and people who are feeling disconnected and plug them in. It'll help people feel connected, but it will connect them to something bad. So the alt-right died with Spencer's ego. Damn, I can't keep scrolling the chat as diligently as I would like. So I'm just so dedicated here to giving good bang to the buck to my employer. But I don't buy the zombie bite theory of information. The other thing that you have to argue if you say you shouldn't interview, right-wing dissidents is that if people get exposed to this type of thinking, they become infected. Right? That they are essentially, there are certain people who are helpless in front of this kind of far-right ideology. And I don't buy that. Right? People only change their minds in radical directions when it's compatible with who they are, when it's meeting needs that their current approach to life is not meeting. So I notice a lot of people on the far right, they talk about Christian nationalism and they talk about wanting to make America Christian, but they don't actually participate in a flesh and blood, concrete, Christian church. When you listen to them and you hear about their life, there's very little in it that strikes you as sacrificing for Christ. And so I think a lot of people talk a good game with regard to Christianity or with regard to Judaism, but inside they're empty. And so something comes along giving them meaning and purpose, but some other people corresponding be victimized by liberal ideology. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Yeah, so some people, listening to Abraham Candy or, some other left-wing ideologues may well join Antifa. Like, what type of people join Antifa? Do you have any good peer-reviewed academic studies on what kind of people join Antifa? And is joining Antifa, is that as likely to ruin your life and be bad to society as joining some far-right cause? So I'm open to the evidence, I'm open to the arguments. I don't think it bothers me to say, oh, I was wrong. I did some shows that were wrong. I've certainly changed the direction of my show since 2018. I've become much more restrictive on what people can say. I've become much more careful about the type of people I bring onto my show. So it wouldn't bother me to say, oh, I was wrong to interview all these Nazis if the evidence is compelling in that direction. But my bias is to believe in the free market of ideas. Good morning, Luke, but why censor distant right information? Why not the left also? Good point. So I guess the elites would argue because when people go left, they don't start shooting people. And generally speaking, we have to admit that there may be something to that argument. So Antifa does not go around murdering people with very few exceptions. So if you tally up the death toll from the quote-unquote far right and compare it with the death toll from Antifa, then Antifa very rarely goes around and murders people. But the pragmatic mainstream liberal world and left-wing world promoted Black Lives Matter, which led to a dramatic reduction in policing, which led to dramatic upsurge in criminal violence, thousands of murders, extra traffic deaths, pedestrian deaths because police backed off law enforcement. So I still don't see how exposing people to far-right ideas is 1/20th as dangerous as exposing people to mainstream liberal ideas. Disrespect for the police is inculcated when very respectable publications like the New York Times and NPR and the ABC here in Australia encourage this completely bogus narrative that the cops are racist. So compared to the dangers inculcated by respectable, mainstream, even centrist ideas, ones promoted by Fortune 500 companies, who had dozens of Fortune 500 companies donated to Black Lives Matter. So I don't see how you can add things up in a way where exposure to mainstream, centrist, liberal, left-wing, leading, dominating ideas in the academy and in mainstream media, how that's not more dangerous than, right-wing ideological ideas. Okay, turn on the pump here. Okay. It's the black one? Oh, how'd you do that?
Put on the P for pump.
Bloody hell.
P for pump?
You're amazing. Oh, shoot. Sorry. Oh, so P for pump. Remember that. Okay. So there are all sorts of dangerous mainstream ideas. Like if you tell people that society's rigged against you, right? That's a really dangerous idea. That's probably destroyed thousands of lives. You tell people society is irredeemably sexist or racist or ageist or bigoted, or that the powers that be will never let you succeed. Right? That's an incredibly dangerous message. Right? I think that's ruined far more lives than far-right ideology. On the other hand, well, does that ideology lead to mass shootings? Well, if society sucks, then there are fewer incentives to be pro-social. And so, that probably encourages an antisocial attitude, which, very likely does lead to an increase in crime. So, one of the major themes of the news media is that society is irredeemably racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobic. And so that encourages antisocial attitudes. So encouraging the most dominant mainstream media narratives and academic narratives, that seems to me far more irresponsible than interviewing people on the far right. So I just don't see that argument holding up on a pragmatic basis. So I think what we're talking about here is maybe an emotional reaction to interviewing people on the far right. So it's understandable that people on the left have an emotional reaction against interviewing people, giving a platform to people on the far right. And so they just instinctively feel these people are evil. And so they can't justify belief in objective good and evil without referencing an objective transcendent source of morality such as God. So maybe what we're dealing with here is just emotion driven. Also, the zeitgeist, right? The zeitgeist focuses on the danger of right-wing misinformation and the danger of right-wing radicalizing. So Steve Salem makes the point that which can't be said publicly, such as that different groups have different gifts, that increasingly can't be thought. And so when it comes time to try to attribute the ills of society to this or that, we can only deal with those possibilities that are allowed on the playing field, right? The elites, right? The gatekeepers, they decide the Overton window. They decide, what ideas we can discuss. And so if there's, say, racial disparity in life results, you can only talk about essentially structural racism, conscious and subconscious racism, and occasionally you can talk about culture, but that's all that's allowed in that discussion. So when your ability to come up with answers for why the world is the way it is severely circumscribed by the Overton window. Remember, Richard Spencer thinks the idea of an Overton window is stupid. He's just sick of hearing about the Overton window. Still think it's a very valuable idea. Then you have to kind of invent these right-wing boogeymen. Right? Because there's so many news media stories about right-wing disinformation, right-wing radicalization, and incel men who've been radicalized online and go on to do horrible things, which I think is true in some instances, but there's no sense of proportion, in comparison to, other ideologies. Bloody heck. So it's kind of breathtaking how we've moved away from the free marketplace of ideas, right? It used to be that every intellectual, whether on the right or the left, the far right or the far left, right, the center, it used to be that every intellectual subscribed to the free market of ideas, right? They overwhelmingly did not believe in the free marketplace for goods and services, but they did believe in the free marketplace of ideas. That was the dominant zeitgeist into, I think, the late 1980s. So it was only with the birth and growth of political correctness that intellectuals started shifting away from the free marketplace of ideas. But am I wrong? Did that not used to be taken for granted by people on the left and the right, that it was better to have a free marketplace of ideas? Well, that's no longer dominant because ideas are now violence, right? In the new deconstructionism, perhaps led by various French thinkers such as Michel Foucault, right? Words of violence, ideas of violence. But this isn't applied to communist ideas, right? It's not applied to left-wing ideas. Only, am I missing something? It seems like only right-wing ideas of violence and right-wing words of violence. And so I don't buy this platform that words of violence and ideas of violence, because I've been called, every awful name in the book, and I'd still rather be called every awful name in the book. You can call me an abuser or a rapist, etc. And I'd still rather you call me horrible things than do physical violence to me. So I'd much rather you commit a microaggression against me than a macroaggression. So I just can't get into the mindset that ideas are violence and that words are violence. I think that type of thinking only comes from the left, and they never, correct me if I'm wrong, they never apply it to left-wing thinking. Right? It's only applied to right-wing thinking. So we've shut down the free market of ideas, right, which used to be the dominant intellectual trend, because apparently, many right-wing ideas and right-wing words are violence. So, kind of a bizarre world that we're living in. Now, this new Decoding the Gurus podcast with Helen Lewis, right? It hasn't been publicly released yet. Not sure if it ever will, but it's on their Patreon. It's absolutely fascinating. They talk about Stefan Molyneux. Like, how do you account for Stefan Molyneux's trajectory? So, started out as a bloke talking about how you shouldn't spank your kids, right? And talked about defooing your parents. Like, if your family won't treat you with respect, then you should completely separate from them. And then he had free domain radio, or maybe still has, because he's such a libertarian. And he billed himself as the biggest philosophy podcast website discussion on the internet, which seems dubious. Reputational destruction is equivalent to physical destruction. Yeah, sometimes, right? Sometimes I would rather be punched than have my sterling reputation sullied. So yeah, there are certain circumstances where words I would experience as more damaging to me than physical violence. But generally speaking, I'd much rather have words said against me than physical violence. But yeah, sometimes the rape, as Dennis Prager points out, the rape of a name is as bad or even worse than criminal rape. I can understand that, because you can have your whole life ruined, and your family's life ruined, and your friends and your community's life ruined by a false accusation of rape. So yeah, there are certain circumstances where words can do more harm than physical violence. Generally speaking, it's not true. But anyways, what's the through line with someone like Stefan Molyneux? Right, started out free domain radio, got its #1 philosophy discussion on the internet, which is absurd, right? It's not just because Stefan doesn't have a PhD in philosophy, but I don't think what he was primarily doing was philosophy. He was primarily talking about human relationships and freedom and libertarian ideas, and cutting off family if they're not conducive to your personal growth. And I usually think that's a really bad idea. I'm sure there are certain circumstances where cutting off family is appropriate, but generally speaking, I'm a big believer in reducing the intensity, frequency, proximity. Intensity, frequency, proximity, and duration of your interactions, rather than cutting people off. Like, cutting people off is such a dramatic step that can really hurt you. Well, that's my life experience. When I've cut people off, I've almost always regretted it. So I just find it pragmatically much better to just turn down the dial on people, reduce the the length of time of interactions, the intensity of the interactions, the proximity of the interactions, so moving from in-person to the phone, and the length of time, frequency, intensity, duration, proximity. Such, more effective, more subtle, more sophisticated way of dialing people up and down in your life. Okay, so then Stefan Molyneux kind of signed on with Donald Trump, ethno-nationalism. He got removed from all major social media, of which I'm aware. And what's Stefan been doing the past 2 years? I haven't heard anyone talking about Stefan Molyneux in the past 2 years. Like, am I missing something? Like, surely is he uploading on Odyssey? Is he in a depression? Is he still doing free domain radio? So Stefan Molyneux seems to be an example of deplatforming, working. Like, his career has been absolutely squelched. His influence has been dramatically reduced. But anyway, they did make a good point in this discussion with Matt Brown, Chris Kavanaugh, and Helen Lewis. They made a good point, like, what's the through line with these secular gurus? And it stung. Right? It really stung, because I recognized very painful truth in here that would also apply to me. And that is, the through line is, how do you feel about Netanyahu suggesting microchipping Israeli children? I think you're talking about vaccination, and so I am all on board with vaccination. So I don't believe that vaccines are microchipping people. I think that's absolutely absurd. I am a big believer in vaccination, though I am not a believer in making vaccination mandatory. But if Bibi Netanyahu wants to make children getting vaccinated mandatory, I don't see it as the worst thing in the world. There are all sorts of vaccines that we make mandatory for children if they want to go to public school. So I'm on board with all the mandatory vaccines prior to COVID for kids if they want to go to public school. And so I'm not appalled if Bibi Netanyahu or other governments want to make it mandatory for kids to be vaccinated for COVID if they want to attend public school, or even, what about private school? I'm not sure about private school, but there's nothing about being vaccinated that installs a microchip in you. I think that's ludicrous. Okay, but getting back to the main topic here, what unites people like Stefan Molyneux, Richard Spencer, Nick Fuentes, Baked Alaska, when they go through all these dramatic ideological contortions. And this was a killer point. And the left sometimes makes good points. So I have to hand it to these guys, because I recognize it's painful truth in my own life. What unites these gurus who go on all these ideological deviations and contortions and seeming self-contradictions, it's a desire to be the guru, right? They're the guy, telling people how to live. And so I went through a phase where I wanted to be a Seventh-day Adventist Christian missionary. And then I went through a phase where I wanted to be a great general. And then I went through a phase where I wanted to be a great politician. And then I went through a phase where I wanted to be a great journalist. Then I went through a phase where I wanted to be, on TV and be a sportscaster. And then I went through a phase where I wanted to be an economist who was always going on TV. And I went through a phase where I wanted to be, a world champion marathon runner. Then I went through a phase where I wanted to spread ethical monotheism to the world and speak to the world about the beauties of Judaism. And then I went through a phase where I wanted to become the expert on the pornography industry. And then I went through a phase where I wanted to be the expert, the Matt Drudge of Jewish life. I went through a phase where I wanted to be the Matt Drudge of Hollywood. And then I wanted to talk to the world about the Alexander technique. And then I wanted to talk to the world about right-wing dissident politics. And then What's the through line through all this? It's like me talking. That's the through line. So with Stefan Molyneux, Richard Spencer, Nick Fuentes, Luke Ford. Oh shoot, I'm not supposed to water those plants. I got so carried away by my live streaming. Hope my brother doesn't find out. Okay, so the through line for all these gurus is, I guess I want to be a guru. And I have to face that. And no matter what ideology I'm subscribing to, I guess there's a substantial part of me that just wants to be upfront talking. I just want to be yakking. I just want to be entertaining and informing and transforming, right? I want to be front and center. And so probably what drives this is probably, an inner emptiness in my life and many of these other people. So I don't have kids. So someone made the astute observation. Ford hasn't propagated his seed, so he wants to propagate his ideas instead. And why guru is overwhelmingly male, right? Because men can't give birth. We have a hero system. We want to play a transcendent role in something that outlives us. And so I think it's this inner emptiness, this fear of insignificance. It's this desire to perform, a yearning for adoration, all right? And yeah, a certain emptiness with reality, so that we want to subscribe to a romantic view of life. So a romantic view of life is someone like Donald Trump is going to save us from the deep state. You don't have to pathologize wanting to teach. Yeah, that's a good point. So all these drives that I'm talking about, there are healthy and unhealthy ways to meet them, right? There's nothing inherently pathological about feeling an emptiness inside, right? That drives you to achieve something. There's nothing inherently pathological about wanting to teach, about wanting to influence, about wanting to inform, wanting to entertain, wanting to connect, wanting to share observations on life, wanting to bounce your observations on life off of other people. So there are pathological and healthy ways of doing all these things. So there is nothing wrong with wanting admiration. Right? It's kind of embarrassing to admit it, but yeah, I want admiration. And that's not inherently bad. What's inherently bad is if you do a socially destructive, personally destructive, antisocial, criminal, embarrassing, shameful, hideous things to get that attention. There's nothing wrong with wanting to teach. It becomes pathological if your need to teach overwhelms your well-being or has a negative effect on other people in your life. So I'm here on vacation, spending a lot of time with family, and sometimes I want to disengage from my family to go live stream. So doing that for an hour or two, not necessarily bad, but if I'm missing out here on like significant family interactions, or say significant opportunities to make money, or significant opportunities to be of service to other people or help other people, because I have a pathological need to live stream. So if I am live streaming at the expense of my own well-being and at the expense of other people's well-being, then it's pathological. Now, that's not my perception of what I'm doing. Like, I believe I'm fitting my live streaming around my life rather than fitting my life around my live streaming. But you can definitely challenge me on that. And so there are times where I'm like, here I'm in Australia on vacation, seeing my family, and there are times that I am purposefully disengaging from family so that I can go live stream for an hour or two. Like, I've got this overwhelming need right now to share my thoughts on this topic, and so I could be perhaps talking to my brother or talking to customers, or I could just be concentrating on my job, and instead I feel driven to talk to you. So yeah, there are healthy and there are pathological ways to be a guru, right? There are healthy and pathological ways to live stream. So if my live streaming is causing people in my family distress, then there's a significant chance that what I'm doing is pathological. Now, we're all getting feedback all the time. The world is giving us feedback. So I am not aware of any feedback from my family that my live streams causing them distress. Now, when I was blogging in the industry, yeah, I got a lot of feedback from my family that my online activities were causing them great shame and distress, and I just ignored that. But I'm not getting that feedback now. So you could argue, well, that's because they're just sick of it. They've given up. They've kind of given up on you. You're a 56-year-old bachelor. You're never going to get it together. They've been so hurt and shamed and embarrassed, and that they've just given up on trying to talk to you straight. But that's not my perception of things. But certainly the world is always giving us feedback. If we have any openness to that feedback, right, it's a lot easier to tell if you're heading in an antisocial or pro-social direction. Also, your bank account. Like, if I am earning money legally in a way that I'm not embarrassed about, then there's a very good chance that I'm engaged in a pro-social direction. So if you're getting isolated by your hobby or avocation or passion, such as live streaming, right, then you're probably headed in a bad direction. And my perception is I'm not being isolated by doing this. Right? Yeah, I'm sure it's cost me some friends and some forms of connection, but I've also gained a lot of other friends and connections, and I find it stimulating, and I read things with a lot more care, knowing that I'm going to want to defend them or explain them or make the case for them in a live stream. So those are some of the incentives. I think more clearly because I have to articulate what I'm thinking to you, and then hear your challenges, and either reformulate my ideas because I recognize you're right, or respond to your challenges in a way that doesn't forever shame me. And knowing that anything that I say and do on this live stream could forever be memorialized in a way that causes me great shame and pain and social embarrassment, right? That's a really good incentive to speak and behave in a pro-social manner. So I think my favorite guide for morality is, what if what you're doing was captured on the front page of the New York Times? And so I think I do this live stream with that idea in the back of my head that any 10, 20, 30-second segment of what I say on a live stream could be captured and show up in some form of media. And so that makes me more careful, more judicious, more considerate of the implications. But also I'm a trad in the sense that I think man's home is his castle. Like, there should be a time and a place where he can just say what he thinks, and he doesn't have to allow the possible implications of what anyone else sees to completely subjugate his own need for self-expression. Okay, time to scroll through the chat. If you take it seriously, it's okay to don't have to pathologize. Notice Luke avoided my question without even researching it. I'm out. Bro, I am at work. I am watering, and I am live streaming. You expected me to research your question while I'm doing all those things and live streaming? Okay, Netanyahu suggested microchipping children. It was covered by the Times of Israel. Google it. Well, maybe I will Google it when I'm done live streaming. You really expect me to water, to work, to take into consideration my surroundings, and Google something while I'm live streaming? I can't physically do it on this phone. This is the only phone I have on me right now. Okay, I don't think people like hearing themselves talk. I think people like being admired. So I don't know anyone who likes hearing their own voice. Reputational destruction is equivalent to social death and exile sometimes. No one cares about the US burning people alive in their homes in World War II. Not many people do. People have been propagandized into thinking that slavery and the Holocaust are singular evils committed by Europeans throughout world history. Is 40 taking a huffing break? No, I had to get my watering fixed. Luke just went for an Aboriginal walkabout. What do you think about people saying Rupert Murdoch's mum is Jewish? I don't know anything about it. But I know that there is a need on the alt-right to say that everyone, in the news media who's important is Jewish. So yeah, people can be correspondingly be victimized by liberal and left-wing ideology. The alt-right died with Spencer's ego is kind of irrelevant compared to more classical thinkers of the right. The CIA fucked up my camera for giving away secret installations. What he's concerned about ex-girlfriend. What makes them think that their enlightened ways are superior? Well, we all have a hero system. The conservative, oh, I didn't hit this. Right, the conservative hero system is more crude. And so that's why liberals are able to fool themselves that they don't have a hero system, because we believe in religion, nationality, community, family, extended family, and we have these concentric circles of loyalty. You could always try to see what goes beyond the substrata of their beliefs, like what lies in their unconscious. Better keep that hose handy in case that happens. What's the building behind you? Anyone who fears the words of Nazis being allowed to be considered has to admit that they think their own views are too brittle, or that other people are too dumb to think for themselves. Luke is the Dr. Fauci of interviewing Nazis. Luke used to rock with NPR while performing labor with a landscaping company in LA back in the 1980s. Now he's creating a podcast while performing labor with the Nazi landscaping company. The circle of life. Yeah, take a Nazi to a gardening shop. Okay, man, come on. All these people get pissed off because I can't simultaneously research something while I'm live streaming. Right? When I research something, it usually requires my undivided attention for something longer than 10 seconds. What level of vagrancy is Luke undergoing while in Oz? Okay, blessings. Bye-bye.